Why was the rookie being ignored during the most dangerous moment of her life? The gunfire echoed through the valley like thunder trapped between mountains, sharp, relentless, the kind of sound that buries itself in your chest and stays there long after the shooting stops. Lieutenant Commander John Maddox pressed himself against the rocky outcrop, dust and debris raining down from the cliff face above. Every breath tasted like metal and fear. 300 meters south, the medical convoy they'd been escorting sat motionless, pinned, vulnerable, bleeding out under the crosshairs of an enemy they couldn't see. Hostile contacts, 11 o'clock, range 400 meters. The voice came through his earpiece, steady, calm, almost too calm. Sergeant Alina Ward lay prone 15 meters to his right, her M40A6 rifle trained on the ridgeline with a kind of stillness that looked almost unnatural. Maddox had opposed her assignment from the start, not because she was female. He'd served with capable women before, women who'd earned every inch of ground they stood on. But Ward, she'd only completed sniper training 6 months ago. 6 months. This wasn't a shooting range in North Carolina where mistakes meant a lower score and bruised ego. This was the Hindu Kush, where angles shifted with shadows, where wind could turn a perfect shot into a fatal miss, where rookie confidence got people killed. Ward, fall back to secondary position. Maddox signaled his assault team to advance. They moved like ghosts through the rubble, trained, synchronized, ready to push through hell if that's what it took, but Ward didn't move. She stayed locked in position, her rifle steady, her breathing controlled. "We're pushing through, sir." Negative. Her voice remained level despite the crack of an AK-47 round striking rock 2 feet from her position. Dust exploded near her face. She didn't flinch. RPG team positioning behind that stone wall. If they get a clear shot at the convoy. "I said fall back." Maddox cut her off, his voice harder than he intended. He could feel the frustration building in his chest. The kind that came from watching someone too green, too eager, making decisions they weren't ready to make. "You're not a sniper, Ward. You're a combat support specialist with marksmanship training. There's a difference." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Cold, final, dismissive. Through his peripheral vision, he saw her adjust her scope, calculating something, reading something the rest of them couldn't see. The sun had shifted, creating a narrow gap between the wall's edge and a support beam. Maybe 2 inches, maybe, but the distance, the angle, the wind gusting through the valley like the breath of something ancient and cruel. It was an impossible shot for anyone, let alone someone this green. Someone who still smelled like training ranges and textbook theory. "Let the bullet speak, sir." Ward's tone carried no defiance, no emotion, just certainty. The kind of certainty that either came from experience or delusion, and Maddox wasn't sure which one scared him more. Before he could respond, her rifle cracked once. The sound seemed to hang in the thin mountain air, suspended like a question no one wanted to answer. Then a secondary explosion erupted on the ridgeline. Fire, smoke, the RPG detonating as the enemy fighter collapsed into nothing. The valley fell silent. Silent except for the ringing in Maddox's ears. The kind of ringing that came after the world changed and your brain was still catching up. He turned slowly, breaking his own cover protocol, watching Ward chamber another round with mechanical precision. Already scanning for the next threat. Already moving to the next calculation. Like what she'd just done was routine. Expected. Easy. "Contact down," she reported, as if she'd done nothing more remarkable than confirm their position. Maddox stood. Around him, 5 SEALs who'd witnessed the shot remained motionless, staring at the smoking crater where the RPG team had been, where death had been seconds away from launching toward that convoy, toward their brothers, toward people who would have died if this rookie, this combat support specialist with marksmanship training, hadn't made a shot that should have been impossible. "All stations, advance on convoy position." Maddox finally found his voice. It came out rougher than he intended, thick with something he couldn't name. He looked at Ward, who had already shifted her aim to cover their movement, professional, detached, like she hadn't just rewritten every assumption he'd made about her. Ward, maintain overwatch. Copy that, sir. As his team moved forward, weapons up, clearing corners and checking angles, Maddox replayed the shot in his mind. The distance, the wind, the target barely visible through that gap. He'd seen it. He dismissed it as impossible. She'd seen it and pulled the trigger. Maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe he'd been wrong about more than just the shot. Elena Ward had learned early that being right wasn't enough. You had to be undeniable. But why had she learned that lesson so young? What drives someone to measure the world in angles and distances? What makes a person willing to carry the weight of precision when everyone around them doubts they can even lift it? 3 years earlier, she'd been a combat medic attached to an army infantry unit in Kandahar province. Young, dedicated, naive enough to believe that saving lives meant you could save everyone. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen had been her closest friend in the unit, a Brooklyn native who could quote Shakespeare while field stripping an M4 in complete darkness. They'd saved each other's lives more times than either could count. The kind of bond that forms when death keeps knocking and you keep answering together. The mission had seemed routine. Extract a wounded Afghan interpreter from a village compound. Get in, get out, go home alive. But routine missions killed more soldiers than combat operations, precisely because people let their guard drop, precisely because routine was the lie war told before it reminded you what you'd forgotten. The Taliban fighter had appeared on a rooftop 300 meters out, an SVD Dragunov rifle aimed at their convoy. Their designated marksman, Corporal Hayes, had been in the vehicle's blind spot, reloading, vulnerable, unprepared. Elena had seen the glint of the scope, had screamed the warning, but by the time Hayes repositioned, Chen was on the ground. Blood spreading across the dust like an accusation. She'd held pressure on the wound for 17 minutes while they waited for air extraction. 17 minutes of watching the life drain from her best friend's eyes. 17 minutes of begging him to hold on, to stay, to breathe. Chen had looked up at her with dimming eyes and whispered words that would haunt her forever. Should have had a better shot, should have been faster. He died before the helicopter arrived, died while she held him, died because someone 300 meters away had pulled a trigger and no one had been fast enough, good enough, ready enough to stop it. Elena had requested transfer to sniper school the next day. The Army had denied her application 3 times. Insufficient combat experience. Unit needs outweigh individual preferences. Consider psychological counseling before pursuing high-stress specializations. The words had been polite, professional, devastating. They'd looked at her grief and seen instability. They'd looked at her determination and seen trauma response. They'd looked at her and decided she wasn't ready, wasn't capable, wasn't what they needed. So she persisted anyway, training on her own time, spending every dollar she had on civilian marksmanship courses, studying ballistics manuals until her eyes burned, calculating wind patterns until she could read the air like a language, learning to speak in bullets because words had failed when it mattered most. Major Sarah Hendricks, a logistics officer who'd seen Elena on the range, had finally pushed the paperwork through, calling in favors Elena hadn't known existed, taking risks on a soldier most people had written off as damaged, as emotional, as someone who needed to heal, not train harder. Sniper school had been everything they'd warned her about, physically punishing, mentally exhausting, designed to break candidates who lacked the temperament for absolute precision. She'd graduated 3rd in her class, but only after the instructors stopped watching her like she was a liability waiting to happen. The Navy had accepted her for a joint operations advisory role with SEAL teams 6 months ago. On paper, she was a combat specialist with advanced marksmanship training. In practice, most of the SEALs saw her as a box-checking exercise, proof that special operations was evolving, whether they liked it or not. Elena kept Chen's dog tags in a sealed pouch sewn into her vest's inner pocket. She'd never told anyone about them. The weight against her chest reminded her why she'd climbed these mountains, Why she lay in the dirt calibrating shots most people would never see. She wasn't here to prove anything to John Maddox or SEAL Team 7. She was here so that when someone like Chen looked up from the ground, bleeding and afraid, there would be someone ready, someone fast enough, someone good enough. The bullet would speak. It always did, and it never lied. What happens when everyone assumes you got lucky, but you know it was science? The forward operating base felt more like a construction site than a military installation. Plywood barracks, gravel paths, the constant generator hum that became white noise after a week. Alina sat alone in the armory, cleaning her rifle with methodical care that bordered on ritual, each piece disassembled, inspected, cleaned, reassembled. The kind of attention most people reserved for things they loved. Alina reserved it for things that kept people alive. Nice shot today. Chief Petty Officer Derek Sullivan leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. Unlike Maddox's skepticism, Sullivan's doubt felt more curious than hostile, like he was trying to solve a puzzle rather than dismiss it. That wind calculation was textbook, maybe better. Thank you, Chief. How'd you read it? The wind, I mean. Flag said east-northeast at 15, but you compensated like it was 20 plus. Alina didn't look up from her rifle. Valley wind. Thermal currents rising along the southern ridge create a shear layer around 400 meters. The flags measure ground-level flow. Sullivan whistled low. They teach that at sniper school. No, I studied meteorology reports for this region. 3 years of data. 3 years, Sullivan pushed off the frame. Most people rotate out after 12 months. I wanted to be ready when I got here. After Sullivan left, Lieutenant Travis Boone entered. Younger than Alina by 2 years. Cocky in the way that came from surviving missions that should have killed you. The kind of confidence that either saved your life or ended it, depending on which day you asked. So Ward, what's your secret? Yoga, meditation, some woman's intuition thing. Alina finally looked up, her expression neutral. Trigonometry, physics, 1,000 hours on the range, same as anyone. Right, Boone grinned. But Maddox says it was lucky, that gap in the wall. Nobody aims for gaps that small. The gap wasn't small. Alina returned to her rifle. It was 2.3 inches at the sightline angle. The M40A6's effective accuracy at that range is 1.5 inches. I had 0.8 inches of margin. Margin, Boone's grin faded. You calculated margin while taking fire. I calculate before I pull the trigger, every time. The conversation died. Alina had learned that explaining her process made people either dismiss her as robotic or resent her for making it look calculated rather than heroic. Neither response helped her do her job. Neither response changed the mathematics. The bullet didn't care about their opinions. It only cared about physics. That evening, Maddox gathered the team for a mission brief. Intelligence had located a Taliban command post in a canyon network 12 kilometers north. They had a high-value target, a commander named Khalid Ghazi who'd orchestrated attacks across the region for 3 years. Ghost, brutal, smart enough to stay alive when smarter men had died. Primary objective is capture, Maddox said, pointing to satellite imagery on the screen. Secondary is elimination if capture proves impossible. We go in at 0500, fast, quiet, before they know we're there. He looked at Alina. Ward, you'll provide overwatch from this ridge, 800 meters out. Keep eyes on the approach and the compound. If things go sideways, we need you ready. Understood, sir. And Ward, Maddox's voice carried something new. Not quite respect, but not dismissal either. No heroics. You take the shots you're certain of, nothing else. I only take shots I'm certain of, sir, always. The next morning, darkness still owned the mountains. Alina climbed to her position, every step deliberate, every breath controlled. By the time the sun began its slow burn across the horizon, she was invisible, settled, ready. The compound below looked almost peaceful. Mud brick walls, narrow windows, a single gate facing east, but peaceful was always an illusion in places like this. Falcon 2 in position, she radioed. Clear line of sight on all approach vectors. Copy Falcon 2, stand by. Maddox's team moved like shadows, professional, silent. They reached the outer perimeter without contact. Too easy, Alina thought, too quiet. Her instincts were screaming, but instincts weren't data. Instincts didn't translate to radio calls, so she watched, waited, calculated distances to every window, every door, every possible position where a threat might emerge. Then she saw it. Movement on the northern ridgeline, 300 meters from Maddox's position. Two fighters setting up a PKM machine gun with a perfect angle on the approach route. Falcon 1, you have hostile contacts. You're 11 o'clock, 300 meters. They're setting up a support weapon. Copy, can you neutralize? Alina adjusted her scope. The range was manageable. The angle was clean, but there was something else, something wrong. The fighters weren't hurrying, weren't watching the compound. They were watching something else, waiting for something. Negative, Falcon 1, this is a trap. They knew you were coming. Say again. It's a trap. Those fighters are bait, there's more. Maddox's voice came back sharp. How do you know? Because they're not watching you. They're watching west, waiting for something. There was a pause, the kind that meant someone was deciding whether to trust gut instinct or tactical doctrine. Then Maddox's voice came back, quieter now. All stations hold position. Ward, find me what they're waiting for. Alina swept her scope west, scanning, reading the terrain like a language most people never learn to speak. Then she saw them. 6 fighters moving through a dried riverbed, flanking position. They'd waited for the assault team to commit, then planned to close the trap from behind. Falcon 1, 6 hostiles, you're 6 o'clock, using the riverbed for concealment. 200 meters and closing. Damn it, Maddox's frustration crackled through the radio. Falcon 2, we need those machine gunners down now. We're sitting ducks if they open up. Alina's finger moved to the trigger. 300 meters, crosswind at 12 knots, downward angle compensation. The math assembled itself in her mind like pieces of a puzzle she'd solved 1,000 times before. She could make the shot. Both shots probably before they realized where the fire was coming from. But something still felt wrong. Falcon 1, permission to hold fire. What ward we need? If I fire, I give away my position. Those flankers will know exactly where I am. You need me more than you need those 2 fighters dead right now. Another pause, longer this time. Then Maddox's voice came back, and there was something different in it, something that might have been trust. Your call, Falcon 2. You see something we don't, you speak up. Copy that. Recommend immediate withdrawal to secondary rally point. Use smoke for concealment. Let them think you retreated. Then we reset. You want us to run. I want us to survive. There's a difference. Could patience be more powerful than a perfect shot? The smoke grenades deployed like fog rolling across the compound. Thick, disorienting, beautiful in its tactical efficiency. Maddox's team withdrew in textbook fashion, moving fast but controlled, weapons oriented on threat vectors, covering each other's movement. The Taliban fighters emerged from their positions, cautious at first, then more confident as the SEALs disappeared into the smoke and shadows. Alina watched them through her scope, counting, memorizing positions, building a mental map of every fighter, every weapon, every tactical decision they made. The machine gun team relaxed. The flankers moved forward, and from the compound more fighters emerged. 9 total now, more than intelligence had estimated. Ghazi himself stood in the doorway, phone to his ear, probably calling in reinforcements. Falcon 2, we're at the rally point. What's your assessment? Alina's voice was calm, almost clinical. They think you retreated. They're consolidating at the compound. Ghazi's calling for backup. If we wait 30 minutes, we'll have every Taliban fighter in the region converging on that position. That's a bad thing, Ward. Or an opportunity, sir. Depends on how you look at it. She could almost hear Maddox thinking through the radio, weighing risks, calculating odds, deciding whether to trust the combat support specialist with marksmanship training who kept seeing things his experience said weren't there. Talk to me. We came here for Ghazi, but if we wait, let them gather, we can call in an airstrike, take out a significant portion of their operational capacity in one strike. The compound is isolated, no civilians, no collateral concerns. And if they disperse before the strike arrives, then I'll make sure Ghazi doesn't leave. But sir, they won't disperse. They think they won. People who think they've won don't run, they celebrate. Maddox was silent for a long moment. Alina kept her scope on Ghazi, watching him gesture to his men, watching them laugh, watching victory make them careless. The oldest tactical mistake in human history. Falcon 2, I'm calling it in. You keep eyes on that compound. If anything changes, you let me know immediately. Copy Falcon 1. The airstrike was authorized within 15 minutes. F-16s inbound, ETA 23 minutes. Alina settled deeper into her position, breathing slow, heartbeat steady. The sun climbed higher, heat beginning to shimmer off the rocks. More fighters arrived at the compound, trucks, motorcycles, men carrying weapons like they were headed to a party. In a way, they were. A celebration of the Americans who'd run, who'd failed, who'd proven that even special operations teams could be outmaneuvered. Ghazi stood on the compound roof now, surrounded by his commanders, planning, coordinating, making himself the most visible target Alina had ever been handed. Falcon 2, target is exposed. You have the shot. Maddox's voice carried a question he wasn't quite asking. A test, maybe. A chance to see if she'd take the glory shot. The one that would make the highlight reel. The one that would prove she wasn't just calculating, but capable of the heroics everyone wanted to see. Negative, Falcon 1. Shot would compromise the airstrike. They'd scatter if I fired. Copy, good call. The minutes crawled. Alina watched through her scope as more fighters arrived. 23 now, 25, 30. An entire network of Taliban command structure gathering in one place because they thought they'd outsmarted the Americans, because they thought retreat meant defeat. Falcon 2, aircraft inbound, 2 minutes. Recommend you relocate after strike. Already planned, Falcon 1. I'll be moving to exfil Point Alpha. The F-16s came in low, fast, the kind of sound that meant death was arriving and there was no time left to pray. The first bomb hit the compound dead center. The explosion was massive, immediate. The shockwave rolled across the valley like the wrath of something ancient and unforgiving. The second bomb followed 3 seconds later, hitting the northern structure where the majority of fighters had gathered. Alina was already moving, weapons secured, position policed, no brass left behind, no evidence that American boots had been on this ridge. She moved down the slope in a controlled slide, using terrain to mask her movement, years of training making her nearly invisible against the rock and dust. By the time she reached the rally point, Maddox's team was waiting, weapons ready, professional, but there was something different in how they looked at her now. Not quite acceptance, but not doubt either. Something in between, something earned. Hell of a call, Ward, Sullivan said, checking his rifle. 30+ enemy KIA, Ghazi confirmed among them. Probably the most successful mission we've run in 6 months. It was the right tactical decision, Alina replied. Nothing more. Nothing more, Boone repeated, but he was smiling now. You just orchestrated a tactical withdrawal, an intelligence exploitation, and a precision airstrike. But sure, nothing more. Maddox approached, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Alina thought he might still find something to criticize. Some way she'd failed to meet the standard he'd set for everyone who wasn't her. You could have taken that shot, he said quietly. Ghazi was exposed, 800 meters, well within your capability. Yes, sir. But you didn't. No, sir. Why? Alina met his eyes. Because killing one man would have saved one operation. Waiting killed 30 and dismantled a command network. The math was clear. Maddox nodded slowly. The math was clear. He extended his hand. Welcome to the team, Sergeant Ward, for real this time. She shook his hand, feeling something shift. Not gratitude, not relief, just recognition. The kind that came when people finally stopped questioning your presence and started trusting your judgment. But there was still something they didn't know, something she hadn't told them, a mission that would test more than her mathematics. What happens when the impossible shot becomes the only option? The intelligence came through 3 days later. 3 NGO workers, humanitarian aid volunteers, had been kidnapped from a medical clinic 40 kilometers north. The Taliban commander holding them was demanding prisoner releases. Money. Concessions the U.S. government couldn't make without encouraging every militant group in the region to start taking hostages. Timeline is critical, Maddox said during the briefing. Intelligence indicates they'll execute the hostages at dawn if demands aren't met. That gives us 7 hours. The satellite imagery showed a canyon complex. Natural caves modified into defensive positions. Multiple entry points. Elevated positions with clear sight lines on any approach. It was a fortress carved by nature and improved by people who understood that geography was the oldest weapon humanity ever mastered. Primary assault will go through the eastern approach, Maddox continued. Narrow, but it's the only route that gives us any concealment. Ward, you'll take overwatch from this ridge. He pointed to a position that made Alina's stomach tighten. 1,000 meters from the main compound. It's the only location with sight lines into the cave network. 1,000 meters, Sullivan repeated. That's pushing the M40A6's effective range. I'm aware, Chief, but it's the only position we have. If things go sideways, if they start executing hostages, we need someone who can make that shot. Everyone looked at Alina. She studied the imagery, calculating. The distance was manageable barely, but the angle was brutal. Shooting down into a canyon meant fighting gravity's pull differently than horizontal shots. The bullets would drop faster, behave less predictably. And the wind in canyon systems was never stable. It swirled, eddied, created microcurrents that changed second to second. I can make the shot, she said, but I need to see the actual terrain before I commit to exact positioning. Satellite doesn't show me wind patterns or thermal behavior. You'll have 2 hours to set up before we move in. Use them wisely. The helicopter inserted them 5 kilometers from the target. Alina moved ahead of the assault team, climbing to her overwatch position in darkness so complete it felt like moving through solid matter. By the time she reached the ridge, her hands were torn from rock edges, her knees bruised from scrambling over loose stone. But she was there. She was ready. The view into the canyon made her recalculate everything. The satellite imagery hadn't shown the depth, hadn't shown how the morning sun would create thermals rising from the canyon floor, hadn't shown the narrow gap between rock formations that was the only clear sight line into the cave where the hostages were being held. Falcon 2 in position. Be advised, wind conditions are unstable. I'm seeing gusts varying from 8 to 18 knots, direction shifting east to southeast. Copy Falcon 2. Can you make the shot if needed? Alina watched the wind, studied the thermals, ran calculations in her mind that involved more variables than she'd ever juggled simultaneously. The bullet would travel for nearly 3 seconds. 3 seconds where wind, gravity, air pressure, and a dozen other factors would push it off course. 3 seconds where mathematics had to predict chaos. If I have to take it, I'll take it. But Falcon 1, that shot requires perfect conditions. Wind has to cooperate. Target has to be stationary. I need at least 5 seconds to calculate and adjust. Understood. We'll do our best to give you that. The assault began at 0430. Maddox's team moved through the canyon like ghosts, using darkness and silence as weapons. Alina watched through her scope, tracking their progress, scanning for threats. Everything was going according to plan, almost too clean, like the last mission, like every mission where the Taliban proved they understood tactics better than anyone gave them credit for. Then the ambush triggered, RPGs streaking from concealed positions, machine gun fire raking the canyon floor, Maddox's team pinned down, taking cover behind boulders that wouldn't stop sustained fire for long. Falcon 2 were taking heavy fire from multiple positions. Can you identify? Alina was already scanning, finding targets, calculating priorities. I count 7 hostile positions. Primary threat is the RPG team, your 10 o'clock 400 meters. They're reloading. Engage at will. Her first shot dropped the RPG gunner. The second took out his loader, professional, efficient. Exactly what her training had prepared her for, but more fighters kept appearing. The Taliban had fortified this position better than intelligence indicated, better than anyone expected. Falcon 1, be advised, hostiles are moving hostages to the cave entrance. I have visual on 3 individuals, hands bound, being positioned at gunpoint. Human shields, damn it. Maddox's voice was strained. Can you get a clear shot on the guards? Alina studied the scene through her scope. 2 Taliban fighters holding the hostages at the cave entrance, using them as protection, daring anyone to shoot. Behind them, deeper in the cave, she could see movement, more fighters, and someone who had to be the commander, Khalid's brother according to intelligence. Younger, angrier, more willing to kill civilians to make a point. Negative, hostages are too close. Any shot risks hitting them. The situation deteriorated fast. Maddox's team was pinned, ammunition running low. The Taliban fighters knew they had the advantage now, knew that American rules of engagement meant they couldn't call in an airstrike with hostages present, knew that patience and cruelty were about to win another victory. Then the commander stepped forward, phone to his ear, talking to someone, probably negotiating, probably buying time while his fighters repositioned to wipe out the assault team entirely. He stood at the cave entrance, backlit by a lantern, 50 feet from the hostages, confident, protected by the same rules that protected the civilians he'd taken. Falcon 2, I have visual on the primary target. Approximately 1,000 meters, your 2 o'clock. Alina found him in her scope. 1,247 meters, her rangefinder corrected. 1,247 meters down into a canyon with swirling winds and unstable thermals. Through a gap between rock formations barely 3 feet wide. At a target who kept moving, gesturing, making a shot that even with perfect conditions would be considered nearly impossible. I see him, Falcon 1. Can you make it? Alina watched the wind, felt it change direction, watched the thermal shimmer rise from the canyon floor, calculated bullet drop, wind drift, the Coriolis effect at this distance, the angle compensation, every variable she could measure and a dozen more she could only estimate. Chen's voice echoed in her memory, should have been faster. This was faster. This was the shot she'd trained 3 years to make, the shot that would save lives if she made it, the shot that would haunt her forever if she missed. I can make it, but Falcon 1, if I miss, they'll execute the hostages immediately. If you don't take it, my team dies and the hostages die anyway. Your call, Ward. Your call. The words carried the weight of every doubt she'd faced, every dismissal, every person who'd looked at her and decided she wasn't ready, wasn't capable, wasn't enough. But they also carried something else. Trust. The kind earned not through words but through actions, through shots made and shots delayed, through mathematics proven and patience rewarded. Alina's breathing slowed, her heartbeat quieted. The world narrowed to the reticle, the wind, and the absolute certainty that physics was either her ally or her enemy. There was no middle ground at 1,247 meters. When the bullet leaves the rifle, mathematics becomes faith. The wind shifted, east to southeast, 13 knots, gusting to 16. The thermal currents were rising stronger now as the canyon floor heated. Alina adjusted her scope. 14 minutes of angle up to compensate for the extreme drop. 6 minutes right for the wind. Then another 2 minutes because the thermal would push the bullet up slightly during its flight. She was aiming at empty air 4 feet above and 3 feet to the right of the target, trusting that gravity, wind, and physics would bend the bullet's path exactly where she needed it. Her finger rested on the trigger, not pulling, not yet, waiting for the moment when every variable aligned, when chaos briefly organized itself into something predictable. The commander stopped moving, stood still for just a moment, phone to his ear, completely unaware that death was calculating its approach from nearly a mile away. Alina's breathing stopped. Her heartbeat slowed until she could feel the gaps between pulses. The world narrowed to pure mathematics. Distance times gravity divided by velocity. Wind speed multiplied by time of flight. Angle compensation factored into both vertical and horizontal drift. It was the most complex equation she'd ever solved with a single trigger pull. Chen's dog tags pressed against her chest. A reminder, a promise, a reason. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle's recoil rolled through her shoulder. The shot felt good, perfect follow-through, no flinch. Exactly the pressure and timing she'd trained for 10,000 times, but feeling good and being good were different things. Physics was unforgiving. The bullet flew for 2.6 seconds, an eternity in combat time. Alina watched through her scope as it arced down through the canyon like a falling star, dropping, drifting, following the mathematics she'd trusted with lives that weren't hers to risk. The bullet struck the commander's center mass. He dropped instantly. The secondary explosion from the RPG he'd been standing near was spectacular. The blast wave knocked the other Taliban fighters off their feet. The entire cave entrance erupted in chaos. Smoke, fire, confusion. "Holy," Sullivan's voice crackled through the radio, awestruck. "All stations, advance now." Maddox's command cut through the chaos. "Move, move, move." The assault became a rout. With their commander down and their defensive positions compromised, the Taliban fighters broke. Some retreated deeper into the caves. Others tried to flee through side passages. Maddox's team pushed through, professional and relentless, clearing positions, securing the hostages. By 0800, they'd extracted all 3 NGO workers, dehydrated, terrified, but alive. The Taliban fighters who'd survived were either captured or scattered into the mountains, their command structure shattered, their fortress taken. Alina remained on her ridge, providing overwatch through the entire assault. 4 more shots at critical moments, each one preventing a counterattack, each one buying time and space for the assault team to do their job. By the time the extraction helicopter arrived, she'd been in position for 6 hours, motionless except for the precise movements required to chamber rounds and adjust her scope. "Falcon 2, you're clear to extract." "Copy, Falcon 1." She broke down her position methodically, policed her brass, erased every sign she'd been there. The climb down took 40 minutes. By the time she reached the compound, General Amanda Keene had arrived by helicopter, along with what looked like half the Tactical Operations Command. Maddox stood outside the main cave entrance. When he saw Alina approaching, covered in dust, rifle across her back, he did something she'd never expected. He called the entire team to attention. Every SEAL stopped what they were doing, stood straight, waited. "Sergeant Ward," Maddox said formally, "General Keene wanted to be here for this." The general stepped forward, holding a small case. She was older than Alina expected, weathered in the way that came from decades of carrying responsibility. Her eyes held the kind of knowledge that only came from watching people die and learning to live with it. "Sergeant, I've been reviewing combat footage from the drone overhead. What I saw," She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. In 30 years of service, I've never witnessed marksmanship of that caliber under combat conditions. That final shot, the one at 1,247 meters, our ballistics team ran the numbers. They said it was theoretically possible but practically impossible. The margin of error was less than 2 inches. Yes, ma'am, Alina said simply. I'm recommending you for the Bronze Star with Valor device, Keene continued. But more importantly, I'm authorizing your full integration into SEAL Team 7 as their designated marksman. No more advisory role, no more probation. You're one of them now, officially. Alina looked at Maddox, who was smiling, actually smiling. Welcome to the team, Ward, for real this time. Sullivan stepped forward and handed her something. A patch. The sealed trident with custom text stitched below it. Let the bullet speak. We took a vote, Boone said, grinning. Unanimous, though I'm still annoyed you make it look so easy. It's not easy, Alina said, holding the patch carefully. It's just calculated. That's what makes it terrifying, Rodriguez added, his arm in a sling but his voice cheerful. You calculate death like it's a math problem. It is a math problem. Alina looked at each of them, at the men who doubted her, dismissed her, and finally, grudgingly accepted her. Every variable matters. Every shot is a story problem. Distance, wind, gravity, temperature. Get the math right and the bullet tells the truth. And what truth is that? Keene asked. Alina thought of Chen, of the promise she'd made, of all the hours spent preparing for moments that lasted only seconds. That precision saves lives, she said, and that being good enough isn't enough. You have to be undeniable. The words hung in the mountain air. Simple, true, earned through bullets and mathematics and the understanding that proving yourself wasn't about one perfect shot. It was about every shot, every calculation, every moment when you chose to let the work speak louder than the doubt. 6 months later, the question wasn't whether she belonged. It was what came next. Fort Bragg Training Facility. The shooting range stretched out like a proving ground for dreams and failures. Alina stood on the observation deck, watching a new class of sniper candidates at the 1,000-meter range. 22 students had started the course. 14 remained. 3 were women. They struggled with the same problems every class struggled with: reading wind, calculating drift, understanding that precision wasn't instinct. It was discipline disguised as talent. They're having trouble with the wind calculation, Maddox said, stepping up beside her. He was stateside for 2 weeks, attending a leadership development course. But he'd made time to visit, to check in, to treat her like the teammate she'd become rather than the liability he'd feared. Same problem every class has, Alina replied. Because they're taught to measure wind, not understand it. Wind isn't a number, it's behavior. It moves differently at different elevations, responds to terrain, creates eddies and shears. You can't just plug it into a formula. Sounds like you should be teaching this course. I've been asked. She watched one of the female candidates adjust her scope, take the shot, miss the target by 3 feet. The frustration was visible even from this distance. But my answer was no. Maddox looked surprised. Why? Because teaching is important, but doing is necessary. There are people who can teach this better than me. There aren't many who can do what I do when it matters most. She glanced at him. Team 7 has 3 more deployments scheduled this year. I'm not walking away from that. No, Maddox agreed. I don't suppose you are. They watched in silence as another candidate fired. This one connected. Not center mass, but solid impact. The instructor's voice drifted up, praising the shot. Progress measured in inches and millimeters. Success defined by getting slightly less wrong each day. I was wrong about you, Maddox said quietly. When you first joined the team, I thought you were a political statement. Proof that special operations was evolving, whether we liked it or not. Alina didn't respond, just waited, giving him space to finish the thought. And now, he handed her a folded piece of paper. Now I know you're not a statement, you're the standard. She unfolded the paper. Official request from SOCOM. They wanted her to help design the next generation of sniper selection criteria. Help identify what actually mattered versus what tradition had always valued. Help build a program that found people like her instead of filtering them out because they didn't fit the expected profile. "They're asking me to define what makes someone qualified," Elena said slowly. "No," Maddox corrected. "They're asking you to define what makes someone undeniable." On the range below, the female candidate fired again. Center mass. Then another shot, another hit. She was finding her rhythm, beginning to understand not just the mechanics but the truth underneath. That precision was a language, that every bullet was a word, that mathematics and physics were tools for translating intent into impact. Elena folded the paper and tucked it into her pocket, next to Chen's dog tags, next to the weight she'd carried for 3 years and would carry forever. "Tell them yes," she said, "but I'm keeping my rifle." Maddox smiled. "I wouldn't expect anything else." As they walked away from the range, Elena heard the distinctive crack of rifle fire, the sound of someone learning to speak in bullets, learning that the quietest people often carry the loudest truths, learning that being dismissed doesn't define you, being undeniable does. The wind shifted. Southwest at 12 knots, steady, honest. Elena read it automatically, a language she'd studied until it became instinct, a skill she'd earned through grief and calculation and the understanding that the world didn't owe you respect. You built it, shot by shot, calculation by calculation, truth by truth. She'd climbed mountains to prove a point, had lain in dust and calculated death to save lives, had turned mathematics into mercy and physics into protection. She'd done it while people doubted, while they questioned, while they waited for her to fail so they could say they'd been right all along. But the bullet had spoken. It always did. And what it said was louder than any doubt, any dismissal, any assumption that she wasn't ready, wasn't capable, wasn't enough. There would be other missions, other mountains, other moments when the impossible shot became the only option, but Elena Ward would be ready. She'd studied the wind, learned the mathematics, understood that precision wasn't about being perfect. It was about being prepared, about trusting the work when trust was all you had left. And when the moment came, when lives hung in the balance and the margin of error was measured in inches, she would do what she'd always done. Calculate, adjust, breathe, trust the physics, trust the preparation, trust that the bullet would speak the truth she'd spent 3 years learning to tell. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. And sometimes the quietest voice carries the loudest truth.